Welcome to Grounded and Soaring, our podcast that explores how we might raise healthy kids in a too often unhealthy world. I'm Sam Shapiro, head of school at Marin Montessori School, and I'm excited to kick off our second season of the podcast with a wide-ranging conversation with two parenting experts. I'm really excited to introduce you first to Sheri Wong, LCSW. She and her partner, who I will introduce, Olaf Jorgenson, recently wrote and published their book, Raising Kids, Your Essential Guide to Everyday Parenting. So Sheri is a family therapist, parent educator, and consultant who is known for offering practical, usable approaches and tools for raising kids. She served as the resident parenting coach for Apple, Gymboree, and Genentech, and has trained healthcare professionals at Stanford Medical Center and UCSF. Ms. Wong lectures at universities, including Stanford, UC Berkeley, and UC San Francisco, consults with faculty at Yale University Center for Emotional Intelligence, and she was a featured speaker at the Pediatrics in the Pandemic Age National Conference for Pediatricians, and her parenting advice has been showcased in the media, including the Wall Street Journal, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the Huffington Post, as well as on the televised national satellite media tour on best parenting practices that reached over 2 million parents across the country. Her co-author of the book is Olaf, or Ole Jorgenson, who has just completed his 20th year as the head of school, serving at Almadine Country Day School in San Jose since 2008. Ole has supported parents at public and private schools in 3 states, as well as in Asia, Europe, and Central America. He works closely with parents on a daily basis and is attuned to the needs, anxieties, and concerns challenging them today, especially in Silicon Valley's fast-paced environment. Ole speaks and publishes widely in education, and his articles and books cover a range of subjects in education. His recent work concerns the impact excessive academic demands have on our student wellness. Ole's parenting expertise was included in the New York Times best-selling parenting book, How to Raise an Adult, by Julie Lythcott-Haims. She also wrote the foreword to the book, Raising Kids. Welcome, Ole and Sheri. Ole, what was it about, or what is it about Sheri's message that you thought was so important at this moment that it gets written down and shared more widely?
I sometimes refer to this book as a toolkit, Sam, because I know there are people who read this cover to cover, but one of the things that parents need now, they're so busy. Our lives are just so, especially in a place like the Bay Area or Silicon Valley, but across the country, parenting life is so busy, and we're juggling so many different challenges that what parents need is a resource where they can they're encountering a parenting challenge in real life, and they can open up a book and say, okay. And all of Sheri's work rests on the notion of takeaways. She just has things that you take and they work.
Sheri, can you tell me about the formation of your understanding about parenting and where it came from, and is there specifically something about today's landscape for parents that is unique compared to other points in your career?
You're asking the right person about today's landscape in relation to others, because I've been doing this for a number of decades. What is compelling to me is that parents often underestimate how completely influential they are in their kids' development. And I don't just mean that they get fed in their health and their education, but I mean their values, their character, their self-image, their self-esteem, their social development, the way they hold other people, the way they hold themselves, how they interact, what matters. My hope has always been to help parents be intentional about it. Not that there's a right way to parent or a right value to have, but that you want to be deliberate about what you are sharing with your kids, and not to give inadvertent messages that later are played out and you regret being the source of them.
Well, okay. So why don't we jump into the topic? And Ole, I know that you say this is Sheri's book, but you're obviously a very experienced educator and work closely with parents. So I really do hope we can hear from you and your thoughts on this. But for those of us, those of us parents seeking to raise healthy kids in today's pretty a daunting landscape, what are the 3 to 5 most important practices and or attitudes that you suggest we bring forth and help us understand why and how?
I would say this very thing that we've been talking about, which we frame in the book as home is the training ground for the way the world works, because parents often want home to be a refuge. It's the place where we do contour to your needs. It's the place where you kids are central. It's the place that you want to be cozy and loving and affectionate. But it is also the place where kids get their messages about how the world works. And so it becomes really important to be mindful of the messages that kids are getting at home from parents. The other part to that really matters is related to resilience and being able to manage in life. During the pandemic, you talk about this landscape of these times. During the pandemic, the kids that did the best managed the best with all of the adjustments, all of the disappointments, all of the pivoting back and forth where you could get whiplash. Mm-hmm. The kids who did the best were the kids who at home had learned in the small ways how to handle a disappointment, how to manage transitions, how to accept boundaries and limits. The things in everyday parenting, which is why we focus on that in the book, everyday parenting. It's not the big deal issues where the teachable moments are. It's in the every single little interaction that allows kids to develop muscle in the areas that they need to. So in the book, we talk about that what kids breathe in at home, they breathe out in the world.
So I'm understanding the home is the training ground. And on the one hand, we have an impulse to make it as sort of loving and cozy and soft as possible for ourselves as much as for our kids. And knowing it's a training ground, are there some lessons that you find parents most frequently avoid?
Disappointment.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of parents have a hard time when their kids are disappointed. They certainly don't want to be the source of disappointment. And when they're not the source, they rush often to mitigate. I shouldn't say they, I should say we. Yeah. We all do this. And as a parent, I certainly did that. My parents did that. And I think we lose track. One of Oli's favorite lines is that disappointment is a feeling, not an event. When kids respond as if it's a big event, there's a big tantrum, there's a big dramatic response. Parents start to say, oh my goodness, this is a big deal, instead of remembering that actually it's a little deal. It's a feeling. It will pass. And your kid has a chance to develop their disappointment muscle.
I'm so grateful you mentioned that, because that really rings true to me as critical. And I'll share, briefly an anecdote from my own, because I'm a we in this. Is when one of our kids got into the college that he really, really wanted to get into, but it just didn't really make sense. Mostly for financial reasons, but also what he wanted to do. And telling him no was a massive disappointment. And as he was expressing his disappointment, everything in me wanted to just say, okay, never mind. We'll make it work for you. Everything in me. And I just had to sit on my hands. And I'm so glad we did, because when I kind of caught my breath, I realized, like, who amongst us gets through life without major disappointments? It is woven into life. And so to try to create a utopia so disconnected from the reality of life we're not actually serving our kids. It's more protecting our own sense of guilt and struggle as we want our kids to always be happy.
And I think probably, Sam, the reason you were able to, as you put it, sit on your hands is that you were able to stand firm on your feet because you were on your spot from head to toe. Your instincts, your judgment, your heart knew what was the right thing to do for your kid and for your family. When we have that kind of clarity, it's just a lot easier. And so, when you drop your younger kid off at school who has separation issues in the fall, and your kid's going to cry and you dread that, so you're tense and cajoling before you even get there, your kid imagines that you're as worried about them being separated from you as they are. Mm-hmm. If you have the clarity that I'm delivering you into good hands and I know you'll be okay, your kid learns to take that in and move past that short discomfort.
It's one of the first things that Sheri introduced us to when she visited, and I've heard her share it with audiences repeatedly, and it's a powerful construct. So the notion of being on your spot, as a parent, Sheri talks about being on your spot from head to toe, and it's a place where you are able to make decisions and take action for your child, because you're certain that it's the right thing to do in your heart, in your head. Your instincts tell you it's the right thing. And Sheri oftentimes will begin this, and we put in the book this sort of metaphor that she sets up. She asks families in an audience, she asks parents, how many of you have trouble, sometimes getting your kids to bed and hands shoot up in the air? And how many of you have trouble, getting up to go in the morning and hands shoot up in the air? How about mealtime, manners, hands shoot up in the air? She'll do 4 or 5 of these. And then she'll say, how many have trouble getting your children to, buckle their seatbelt? And very rarely does a single hand come up in an audience of a couple hundred people. And Sheri says, well, why is that? And people say, well, it's not negotiable. Well, why? Well, it's the law. Does your 3-year-old know, the legal code? No, it's because you're on your spot. It's the right thing to do. You're clear on it. You have conviction. It's a loving thing. You're with your child. You care about your child's safety, and your child senses that and just knows that you're on your spot about that. That's, Sheri calls that, and you referred to it, Sam, as a seatbelt. If you have a seatbelt issue, parents for whom getting out in the morning and getting to work is a seatbelt, like that has to happen, tend to have fewer challenges getting the kids out the door in the morning.
So the thing about the head to toe part about your spot is it's an alignment, right? Your head says about a seatbelt, this is what the research shows is safe. Your heart, which connects you to your kid, says, I want my kid to be safe. Your instinct is that all of this protection is the right thing to do. You're not being overprotective. You're just being safe. So your feet, you can stand firm and walk your talk. You can insist on it with your kid, and they get that you mean it. So nagging is really when you're out of alignment. It's too big a deal to you somewhere in you to let it go. Either your head says, hey, this is important, but you don't have the heart to insist on it. Or your instinct says this matters, but you can't justify it. So somehow it's a big enough deal that you can't let it go, but not a clear enough deal to you that you're going to stand firm. And so what you do is you keep repeating yourself and say it over and over again, which is what we do. And when parents say, what can we do to eliminate nagging? I always say, either take it on or let it go, but don't hang out in the nag zone. So what I'll have parents do is make a list of the behaviors or the things that go on, the patterns at home that you really don't like, and make the list as long as you want. Now go back over the list and circle the things that you're ready to deal with now, that you will do what it takes. The other ones are going to all be not yet. You'll get to them, but you're not there yet. Then you end up with a handful of things that one by one you get on your spot about. Parents can't do that alone. This is where schools come in, because there's some things parents it's just not on their radar to understand that their kids need to be more independent about something, or that something's going to be asked of them in the school situation. In a classroom, like, for example, kids at home, parents often defer to a kid's needs. You're playing Legos with your young kid, or you're doing something with your teenager, and you'll say, okay, we'll go to the movie you want to go to, or you can have the good parts of the Legos. But in school, where primarily they're interacting with peers, there's more reciprocity required. So when the teacher gives feedback that your child has a little trouble with the give and take, can you work on that at home? Then parents know, wow, I need to work on give and take with my kid at home. There's a lot of things that schools need to communicate to parents about. This is what we observe. This is what we'd like to see. Can we partner to support your kid to develop that?
So, Oli, how about you? What comes to your mind in terms of everything you're seeing, both as a parent and an educator?
What parents do at home and in life outside of school with regard to building, supporting their children's self-esteem, is maybe incomplete and may not support the experience of children at school, because we know that a lot of us try to make sure that our children feel special and unique, and we as parents we try to highlight those ways in which our kids are special and unique. And what Sheri often tells audiences is that true self-esteem in a child depends on knowing two things: that you are unique and special, and that you're just like everybody else. Self-esteem depends on both things.
Kids, in order to feel good about themselves, they really do need to know both that they're special and unique, and they're just like everybody else. And the art of parenting is knowing when to give which message. True self-esteem means having regard for self and others simultaneously. I used to tell parents, but for a mere exception, the world consists of others.
Yeah, beautiful. So now the idea of home as training ground, especially around kind of learning how to normalize disappointment. Really thinking about we do want our kids to have a strong sense of self and self-esteem, and that requires a true awareness of my uniqueness as a child, as my parents' child, my uniqueness, my brilliance, my the wonder of who I am as an individual, as well as the fact that I'm pretty much just like everybody else in my fundamental needs, and I'm part of this human community and society. I'm curious if that's, if there are other points that come to your minds around what would you most want parents to really consider. Maybe we'll go back to Sheri as they raise their kids in today's world.
I'll tell you the topic that comes up the most with both parents and schools, teachers in particular, is limit setting. Both kids being able to handle limits and boundaries. Of course, the disappointment issue comes into play here, but it's also about parents and teachers sometimes being able to set limits. Teachers tend to be a little better about it just out of sheer survival. There's so many kids, you can't not hold kids to boundaries and civility. But Parents often have a hard time setting limits because they don't want to be unkind. Sometimes they don't want to be restrictive, which may give kids an inadvertent message that when you don't get to do your want tos, that have tos are somehow terrible things to have to do. And have tos often lead us to the best want tos there are for us to have. Also, managing routines. Young kids love rules, rituals, routines. They love to be able to predict how it works, how it's going to happen. As kids get older, they feel a little confined by that, but they like to know the policies or the operating principles. Like, hey, handle your homework your own way, but it's business before pleasure in our house. I have a bit of a pet peeve about threats, because a lot of parents use them because it's hard to resist the leverage. If you don't do that, I'm taking the iPad away. If you don't come now, then there won't be any stories tonight. If you're not home by this time, you don't get to use the car next weekend. There's a if then kind of threat. The problem, the part about that makes it compelling is that it gives you some leverage. You feel some power, some control, and it's often effective. The sad thing is that there's a price you pay, which is that kids who are raised with a lot of threats for leverage end up either being someone who threatens to get leverage or somebody who's susceptible to threats. So a simple gimmick, this is one of Oli's favorite, is instead of if you don't finish your homework, then you don't get to go to the party. It's when your homework's done, we can leave for the party. It's not a power struggle between you and me. It's a way that it works.
And it's also, it's also just teaching our kids about natural consequences. You're not in your core and in your being, you're not a bad person for not doing your homework. You're not a bad being for not doing your homework. But the consequence of that is that you're not going to the party. That's just the way it works.
Well, I tend to want to use the word the result or the way it worked out,
as opposed to
because that's more neutral sounding. Consequence tends to be a Bay Area word we use for punishment often.
Yeah.
It's when they say consequence, they mean a punishment. And honestly, the question, if someone were to ask me what's the question I've heard the most in my office over the years, it's when I make a suggestion about how to manage something and the parent says, what should the consequence be if the kid hasn't done it? And I say, you haven't even said anything to them yet, and you're already planning on failing. So that's not being on your spot. There's no reason not to give a kid agency if you can.
Yeah.
And if it comes from the kid in a way of, I want to be seen here too, I want to be part of the equation. If it's coming from a power struggle place, then you need to step back and just get out of the power struggle. All families have things that are going well. In my family therapy practice, parents rarely come in to recount all the things that are going well. They come in to tell me what's not working. And I ask them what's working. You wouldn't be surprised how often someone says nothing. I feel so not effective about anything. So then I start asking, you mean your kids won't get dressed? Oh, no, they get dressed. You mean you can't? Oh, no, they do that. So they weren't born doing those things. Somehow you were effective with those things. And so let's look at the difference between the areas where you're effective and the areas where you aren't, and see if you can't borrow some of that conviction and bring it over to the other areas.
Parents give all kinds of messages, and most of the messages from parents are are intentional and effective, but that there's also this whole set of unintentional messages they send. You know, when a parent steps in on what Sheri would call kind of a little deal with a long email to a teacher, or requesting a meeting, and the child knows that the parent is intervening on their behalf, the unintentional message that can send, Sheri will sometimes point out, is that the parent doesn't believe the child has the sturdiness advocate for themselves.
A really important thing is to keep things right-sized, and often our responses, and honest to goodness, I raised kids too. I know that sometimes my reaction was so not right-sized, so outsized, because I was tired, because it was cumulative, because something about it triggered some anxiety in me, that I would have a bigger response than was warranted that would give my kid a message that this is a bigger deal than it is. And we're bound to do things like that now and then. It's no big deal that we make those mistakes, but it's really good to be mindful of, am I giving my child the message I intend? So if your older child is being unkind to your younger child, and you treat the younger child like they've been victimized by the older child who you're vilifying, you're giving your kids messages about their roles, about how you see them, about a role that they'll tend to take on, instead of saying this is an interaction that happened. We want to have these kind of interactions rather than those kind of interactions. What is often called misbehavior is really just kids trying to figure out how the world works. And so if you approach your children when they're out of bounds or when they're out of turn with something, with just the sense of, oh, they need to learn about this, they don't know about this. Or maybe just in that moment they had a lapse, so they need a reminder. So they may need instruction, they may need reminding, they may need reinforcing. They may need their attention shifted from one place to another, or to include something. There's always a need behind behavior that's out of bounds. And if we can address that need, we can also gently get kids on track.
Well, I'm aware of time. So grateful for this conversation. I learned a ton myself. So thank you so much. Really helped.
Great to meet you, Sam.
Yeah.